Hello everyone and welcome to the next video for Global History. I'm Mr. Langella, also known as Langella Sensei. Hope you guys are doing well. We just last time finished on section 2 of chapter 12 that covered the Mongol conquest with Genghis Khan and even some of the descendants that expanded throughout Asia and even parts of Europe as well. So this is going to be covering section 3, which is going to cover the Mongol Empire. Okay, so as I did last time, I'm going to cover some of the material that's inside the PowerPoint, probably show you guys a little bit of video, and also talk about the worksheet that goes along with this PowerPoint. So let's get at it. All right. So the Mongol Empire. So now we're really going to focus on Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan. All right. So just give you guys some background here. As I mentioned, when Genghis Khan does pass away, the different regions, or basically the Mongol Empire kind of expands, and it does break up into different regions. But Kublai Khan has basically the greatest of the Khan leaders, right? And he does expand the Mongol Empire into what we know as the Pax Mongolia, right, or the golden age of the Mongols, right? So when the empire does split into four Khantes, the other descendants of Genghis ruled Central Asia, Persia, and Russia in semi-independent states. So Kublai focused on, instead of expanding the empire and range in his own Khante, which already included all these different areas, he began to fulfill the goal of his grandfather to conquer all of China, right? Instead of trying to expand even more, because he already controlled like all these different areas that are mentioned, but he wanted to control all of China, okay? So Kublai Khan is the grandson, and we already mentioned this. He becomes a great Khan in 1260, right? He conquers China by 1279. So when he establishes his reign, it's known as the Yuan dynasty, right? The period of peace and prosperity, which would lasted from 1279 to 368, all right, AD. So the Yuan era was an important period for China for many different reasons. I outline them here. So very first, he united China for the first time in more than 300 years, and he was considered China's greatest emperor. Secondly, the control he imposed by the Mongols across Asia had basically opened up China to the greatest foreign contacts and trade that they've ever seen before. Because remember, China was very particular with who they had contact with before the Mongols had taken over. And as I mentioned in the previous video, the Mongols are very open to new foreign ideas and cultures. So for the Mongols to take over, it basically opened up China completely. And then finally, Kublai and his successor tolerated Chinese culture and made few changes to the system of government. So we already know that the Chinese government was already great with the bureaucracy web that controlled all aspects of society. And Mongols didn't really change that. They kind of kept it the same. It worked. And they were never really those to change anything. They always kept it the same, and they used to actually absorb in a lot of the different cultures and traditions that the areas that they conquered already. So they already adopt the Chinese ways and actually build the capital in Beijing. Now, his failure though, because Kublai wanted to expand it into the region of China, right? And China did control Korea. But the one area that they could not get was Japan. He had failed to control Japan because of a massive typhoon that had destroyed their invasion force, right? His second fleet carried 150 Mongols. And basically, this typhoon, this path to get to Japan, they have to sail over the seas to try to get there. This typhoon, this massive storm, destroys his fleet. And it basically cripples any sort of conquest he had to try to take Japan, right? In Japan, the Japanese speak vehemently about this typhoon, which they call as the kamikaze, which is also known as divine wind that had saved Japan. So that's why when they call it the kamikaze, it's a pretty important term or important phrase that kind of goes along with their culture for a very long time. All right, so the Mongols and the Chinese. So now we look at how Mongols lived separately from those that they had conquered. That basically they followed their own laws. So they had the Chinese laws, and then they had the Mongol laws. So if you were a Mongol, you can live whichever way. Based on your group, you lived on those type of laws, while the rest of the Chinese society lived by whatever the Mongols felt you should live by, right? they kept the Chinese out of high government offices, which meant that they didn't really allow them to kind of pick and do anything on a major level, but they did keep them on the local level. All right, they made sure that they could run their day-to-day things, but they didn't allow them to change anything major that might affect the Khans as much. Okay, so let me ask you this question: how might the Chinese have felt about their lack of power in Kublai's government? Right, because think of it this way: most of the high government posts went to Mongols or to outside forces as in foreigners. And how do you think the Chinese people felt as that the point where these high ranking positions were, instead of going to Chinese officials, were going to Mongols, or better yet, foreigners, people that weren't even of the area or even part of the Mongols themselves? So I want you guys to answer that in your PowerPoint. All right, and they felt, the Mongols, the reason why they did this was kind of like a spit in the face to the Chinese individuals, as in they felt that these foreigners were more trustworthy than those that were locally governing. So there's clearly an animosity between the two. Now, under Kublai, the Great Canal that was already built was now expanded. They now created a road system, created a highway system, so that there's more communication, there's more trade being developed. And with these new routes by land and sea, there's now a steady flow of grain and other types of goods that are flowing through the areas controlled by the Mongols. Now, as I mentioned already, trade increases, but now trade increases alongside with other foreign powers as well. So now we start to see more different types of products being sent. Now, Chinese products are being sent all over the world, and now people are just demanding to trade more with China. And Kublai even himself encouraged foreign merchants to visit China to trade their products directly in their markets. So most of them were Muslims from India, Central Asia, and Persia, but there were even European traders and travelers as well, including Christian missionaries that have actually made it to China themselves. Specifically, one of the most famous was Marco Polo, right? He was a Venetian trader, visits China in 1275. So basically, Marco Polo ends up kind of working for Kublai Khan, and to go on to not only to go to different Chinese cities and government agencies within the Mongol Empire, but he sends them on different government missions for him. He serves the Great Khan for 17 years, and in 1292, Marco Polo left China and made the long journey back to Venice. All right, when he returns there, and he was questioned about some of the things that he had saw. He talks about these beautiful cities, the wealth, the coal that they had found. They call the black stones to use to heat these Chinese homes. All right, and talks about how well Kublai Khan's government and trade was, especially with Beijing. Right, these stories were gathered to a book and actually were read by most of the people out in Venice and even throughout Europe. Specifically, I gave you guys a primary source right here. It gives you a quote from Marco Polo within the book. It was known as The Travels of Marco Polo. And at the very top here, I want you guys to answer this question. Why do you think Kublai Khan employed Marco Polo? I give you guys two basically character development little sections here. One that covers Marco Polo and one that covers Kublai Khan. All right? So I want you guys to read those as well. All right. So now we're going to start to talk about the decline of the Mongol Empire. So during the last few years of the Kublai Khan's reign, weaknesses started to appear. Now, what happens is he ends up setting a few expeditions into Southeast Asia, and he ends up spending a lot of money into conflicts, into basically wars that don't really mean much to them at all. As in, they didn't really win these battles, and then on top of that, they were just useless. They were for nothing. And then on top of that, he spent a lot of money on public works and had spent money on luxuries for the high-ranking officers of the Mongols. All these different things that he spent money on had basically burdened the treasury, which is extremely important. And just like many of the other Chinese dynasties we've seen before, they follow the very, very bad path of overtaxing the Chinese people, right? This creates not only a resentment, but there's more animosity than ever before. We already seen the point where you can look back and say, why? I mean, the Mongols had put foreigners as high-ranking officials and Mongols. made the Chinese people themselves feel isolated. Then all these different things occur. There is more animosity growing. So the Yuan dynasty is then overthrown. Now the question is, I really want to ask you guys, what factors contributed to the decline of the Yuan dynasty? Right? And I want you guys to look back at the other slides as well, answer the question here so at least I can see whether or not you understand what leads to this point. So when Kublai dies in 1294, he was never overthrown himself because he was a great leader, but his successors were not, right? And they were overthrown. Now, they had long resented the Mongol rulers, and I mentioned to you guys all these different things that had led to the moment. And Kublai Khan, when he died, his successor was not as good at keeping the Chinese people under wraps, as not letting them get to having too much influence, too much power to then overthrow that government. But this was fueled by years and years of hatred, corruption, economic problems, famine, natural disasters like floods and diseases, and now it all led to this, right? And it led to being overthrown. Now in 1300s, these rebellions had broke out, leading to the formation of the Ming Dynasty all the way in 1368, right? So not only was the Yuan dynasty in China overthrown, remember, at a certain point, there were 4 khantes that were separated by different regions, as in the Mongols had basically separated themselves into different groups all over Asia and parts of Europe. So in China, they were thrown out by 1368, but the Mongol had lost their power in Persia in the 1330s, and then by the rest of Central Asia by the end of 1370, right? And then by the end of 1300s, the only Mongol rule that was still remaining was the Golden Horde in Russia, which we talked about in the previous chapter. So I want you guys to answer these questions here. Try your best, and we'll talk about when we get back. I also provide you guys a nice timeline here. Now, this one's going to be a little more complicated, as in, listen, this will be more difficult if I give you a question about the different chronological order, and we'll talk about that when we get to that moment. But this is a good thing to have. It talks about all the different Chinese dynasties from 500 to 1400. And I want you guys to finally answer these 2 questions here, the main idea questions. We'll want to explain how Kublai Khan treated his Chinese subjects, and then number 2, how did Kublai Khan encourage trade? And these pages are found in 335 to 338 in your textbook. All right, that's going to be it for today, guys. Our last video for the week is going to be on feudal powers in Japan, and then section 5, which is going to cover the other Southeast Asian empires that include Korea. Okay? All right, guys. Well, have a good one. We'll see you soon.